Chapter 20. Departure. Grief. Chicago didn't celebrate. That was the strangest part. When the killings stopped, there were no fireworks, no headlines declaring victory, no public gratitude for law enforcement or divine intervention. Just quiet. A fragile, suspicious quiet. The mayor held one final press conference. He called it a transition in operations. He thanked the public for resilience. He credited coordinated intelligence efforts without explaining what that meant. He never mentioned the man. He never mentioned the bodies. The city moved forward like someone stepping over a crack in the sidewalk and pretending they didn't almost fall. I stood at the back of the room and watched a narrative being sealed shut. Chicago was being allowed to forget. I wasn't. The call came at dusk. "You have 1 hour," the voice said. No location was necessary. They sent a vehicle. The ride was silent. Not tense, not ceremonial, just efficient. The airport they took us to wasn't O'Hare. It wasn't Midway. It was a stretch of concrete most residents didn't know existed. Private, controlled, unmarked. The jet waited with its engines already humming. He was standing near the stairs when I stepped out of the SUV. No restraints, no guards gripping his arms, just 2 men in civilian clothes positioned like punctuation marks. He looked different outside Chicago. Lighter, somehow. Not relieved, unburdened. Because the city was no longer his equation. Justice. Daniel felt no attachment to the skyline as it shrank behind him. Completion does not require sentiment. Chicago had been a system under decay. He had accelerated its collapse and restructured its equilibrium. Imperfectly, but irreversibly. The conditioning was clearer now. He could feel it operating like architecture beneath his thoughts, redirecting grief away from paralysis and into objective. Emotional weight converted into trajectory. The men briefing him on board did not waste time. Cartel influence maps filled the cabin screens. Supply routes, enforcement tiers, political alliances. Unlike gangs, cartels possessed embedded sovereignty. Territorial command structures reinforced by paramilitary discipline. They would not fragment easily, which meant elimination would require adaptation. Daniel studied the data without comment. This was not escalation. This was expansion. Grief. I hesitated at the bottom of the stairs, not because I was afraid of flying, because this was the line. Chicago had been a story I could touch, a city I knew, streets I could walk to verify truth. Mexico was something else. Cartels weren't fractured street networks. They were economies, armies, institutions. And I was being invited not as a reporter chasing crime, but as a witness to engineered collapse. "You don't have to come," one of the men repeated. The lie again. Because if I stayed, the story would continue without me, shaped by people who spoke in phrases like acceptable loss. I climbed the stairs. Justice. Daniel noticed the reporter's hesitation. Not weakness. Conscience. Conscience introduces friction. Friction introduces unpredictability. That might prove useful. Mexico would not be Chicago. There would be no gradual dismantling through urban compression. There would be blood at scale. Corruption layered into governance. Civilian casualties embedded in operational terrain. The program had trained him for emotional nullification under stress. It had not accounted for sustained geopolitical complexity. That made this phase a true test. He did not resent that. He welcomed it. Grief. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was clinical. No luxury, no insignia, just screens, dossiers, and men who believed in models more than people. They handed me a thin folder. Embedded authorization, it read. Conditional, controlled, revocable. "You document," the man said, "but you coordinate." "With who?" I asked. He nodded toward the father. With him. The engines roared louder. Outside the window, Chicago's lights blurred into abstraction. I looked across at the man who had cleaned a city with surgical precision and asked the only question that mattered. Do you believe this ends? He didn't answer immediately. He studied the map of Mexico glowing between us. No, he said finally, not cynical, not hopeless, certain. This evolves. Justice. Daniel watched the border approach on the digital display. The program had never intended permanence, only utility. He understood now that grief had not been nullified. It had been weaponized, redirected toward systems deemed unsustainable. Chicago was data. Mexico would be proof. He did not view himself as villain or savior. He was mechanism, and mechanisms do not question their existence. They function. Grief. The plane crossed into foreign airspace without ceremony. No announcement, no applause, just coordinates shifting quietly on a screen. I realized then that the story I thought I was telling had never belonged to Chicago alone. It belonged to a question much larger. What happens when the state discovers that grief can be engineered? I looked at the father again, at the man who had lost a son and become something else. Somewhere below us, a different war was waiting. I opened my notebook, not to record death, to record intention, because this time I wouldn't just be chasing a mind, I would be traveling with it. Epilogue image. The jet descends toward a strip of light carved into darkness. The father sits still, hands resting calmly. The reporter watches him, pen poised. No one speaks. Below them, Mexico breathes. And somewhere far behind, Chicago finally sleeps.